Hey everybody, this is the stuff at the beginning and the intro to uh, Thomas T. Sekine's Marx, Una, and the Critique of Economics Towards an Ex-Capitalist Transition. This book is from, what year? 2023. Preface. Several years ago, a young American gentleman came to spend a summer in Tokyo, and during his stay there contacted me hoping to arrange an interview with me to be concentrated on my own Unoist approach to Marxian economics. While willing to cooperate with him in that project, I was not confident from the beginning that I would be able to produce a satisfactory result for him. For I am not the type of person who has ready-made answers to questions that are typically thrown at him/her on the spur of the moment. Nevertheless, we thoroughly enjoyed meeting with each other and got along very well in our personal exchange of views on the subject matter. When he was about to leave Tokyo, I asked him to write down on paper a series of questions that he would have liked to ask me, which would give me the chance to elaborate upon. I thus obtained a series of wonderfully worded and exquisitely phrased questions that would have given me only delight and pleasure to answer. I have revisited these questions over the years and have had time to consider them against the progress of my lifelong research on Una's approach to economics has made since then. I now have a fully extended, more mature version of what makes economics a, quote, objective knowledge. I now have a fully extended, more mature version of what makes economics a, quote, objective knowledge. In both parts, but especially in the first, I made use of the delightful phrasing that my American friend originally employed in posing his apt questions to me. I am grateful for his allowing me to reproduce once again some of his superb style of language in this book. As before, I wish to explain how the Sekine approach to economics responds to the challenge of economics as objective knowledge. How the Sekine approach to economics responds to the challenge of economics as objective knowledge, uncontaminated by subjective, ethical, and ideological biases. Also, as before, this book consists of two parts. In the first, I concentrate on Uno's methodology as I understand it now. That is to say, I wish to show how Uno learned from Marx's method in, quote, critiquing bourgeois classical political economy and subsequently elaborated and refined it further to its limits. That, however, is an exercise that generations of Marxists, being always more involved in revolutionary practice of one sort or another, have entirely failed so far to face up to. Thus, whereas they were successful in making Marxism more subjective and dogmatic, and hence less scientific and objective, Uno made it exactly the reverse. That is, Uno made it more objective and scientific by blotting out its subjectively ideological and non-scientific claims. More objective and scientific by blotting out Marxism's subjectively ideological and non-scientific claims, concentrating on the methodology of economics peculiar to Kozo Uno, which I wholeheartedly support, though, in a sense, boldly to the extent of wishing to restate it as my own, quote, dialectic of capital approach, end quote. I contend in part one basically the following 2 points. 1. Marx's critique of classical political economy was, without any doubt, inspired and undertaken by applying the Hegelian method of logical, dialectical investigation, far more so than Marx himself was aware of or was willing to acknowledge. Marx's critique of classical political economy was, without any doubt, inspired and undertaken by applying the Hegelian method of logical, dialectical investigation, far more so than Marx himself was aware of or was willing to acknowledge. 2. Uno's contribution essentially lies in bringing that fact into the open by, quote, translating, end quote, in effect Hegel's metaphysical book, Logic, Science of Logic, into an economic theory of a purely capitalist society. in which all use values are deliberately nominalized so as to drop all of their sensuous connotation. Those who overlook and gloss over, or who intentionally ignore, this fundamental connection will never comprehend the real import of Marx's and Uno's work in economics. I know that this singular contention of mine will not be readily accepted by the currently learned public, because the latter has never before even heard of such a strange or odd and bizarre, such a strange, parenthesis, or odd, bizarre, and fantastic, question mark, in parenthesis, story. My job, however, is to make that crucial fact less strange and unfamiliar, for without resorting to the distinctly Hegelian method, neither Marx nor Uno would have accomplished what they did in economics. Part 2 deals with the process of disintegration rather than development of capitalism in the present-day world, which since as far back as 1974, I have called the process of ex-capitalist transition. The process of ex-capitalist transition. This is how I interpret Uno's claim that after World War I, capitalism has never entered a fourth stage of capitalism's development, which broadly agrees with Karl Polanyi's idea that the world economy then entered the process of a, quote, great transformation, and, quote, out of the capitalist era, which to him belonged essentially to the 19th century. There are many other writers who adopt a similar view, yet why was it precisely at that juncture that the capitalist market suddenly ceased to be self-regulatory? While empty verbiage continues to abound in the form of uncertain observations and subjective impressions, one thing is certain to me. That is that economists have so far failed to convincingly explain what it was that then crippled capitalism's erstwhile power of self-regulation. That is, that economists have so far failed to convincingly explain what it was that then crippled capitalism's erstwhile power of self-regulation. The national economy thenceforward introduced by necessity a large and ever-growing, quote, government sector, end quote, side by side with the, quote, private sector, end quote, so that all of today's economies are now, quote, dual and so-called, quote, mixed economies. While economists fail to explain this, a large number of politicians, commentators, publicists, journalists, and opinion makers become understandably impatient and begin to speculate on all sides as to what to make of the recent evolution of, quote, capitalism. Yet what they do amounts merely to inventing plausible adjectives such as, quote, current, contemporary, present day, today's, end quote, or, quote, modified, revised, revived, reorganized, end quote, or, quote, global, financialized, digital, super modern, end quote, and the like, ad infinitum, to requalify capitalism, the identity or thing in itself, which is conveniently kept hidden, is, quote, unknowable, end quote, exclamation point. The Uno Marxian approach to economics, unlike bourgeois and conventionally Marxist approaches, shuns that kind of methodological hocus pocus. For, by relabeling capitalism with a new perfunctorily chosen modifier, we solve no real economic problem. We must understand what it means for capitalism to lose capitalism's self-regulatory power. We must understand why, when capitalism enters the process of capitalism's disintegration, a Great Depression or recession is liable to occur, which does not self-heal. Therefore, we need deliberately to pump active, not idle money into the system. As if to spread legal tendered banknotes from a, quote, helicopter in the sky over the people down below who desperately need to gain access to more active, not idle money as the means of purchasing commodities. So as to accelerate their circulation and thereby to galvanize the economy's activity level to its fully supplied potential. Idle money which is inconvertible into capital, and which must in the meantime be hoarded, i.e., held in readily marketable securities, earning negligible interest, until a new opportunity for promising gambles arrives, is not up to such an ambitious task. Idle money, which is inconvertible into capital, and which must in the meantime be hoarded, i.e., held in readily marketable securities, earning negligible interest, until a new opportunity for promising gambles arrives, is not up to such an ambitious task. This lesson, though already known and available in the latter half of the 1930s, was never seriously learned, nor applied even to make a slight dent in the scourges of the Great Depression in the 1930s, which only belatedly receded with the onset of World War II. That was because even FDR was so desperately committed to the false virtue of a, quote, balanced budget, end quote, the key word for the defense of the now obsolete and moribund bourgeois state. In a mixed economy, however, the government sector cannot balance its budget unless it is permitted to tax and levy all of the hoarded money that amasses in the private sector of the economy when it fails to invest that which it saves. For otherwise, the gross domestic expenditure, GDE, must fall short of the potential gross domestic product, and that will depress the national economy. That is what Keynes cogently described as the euthanasia of the rentier. But is that realistic? For civil society does not normally stage a revolution whereby to expropriate the rich, consisting mostly of the leisured class of which the members earn their incomes not from work but from wealth. We must invent a suitable device to accomplish this in a relatively peaceable fashion, which the bourgeois nation-state could not have managed, given that the latter's economic functioning was still tethered to gold money. We must invent a suitable device to accomplish this in a relatively peaceable fashion, which the bourgeois nation-state could not have managed, given that the latter's economic functioning was still tethered to gold money. However, now that gold has long been, quote, demonetized, end quote, and we must willy-nilly employ fiat paper money printed by virtue of the seigniorage right of the sovereign nation-state, we should be able to skillfully devise the way to painlessly and humanely accomplish that euthanasia of the rentier. I suggest in part 2 of this book that there is one possible way to circumvent the hoarding of money by the rentier without resorting to its taxation or expropriation. That, however, can be done only by combining monetary and fiscal policy in the traditional sense into one. Which in turn becomes possible only when the state can entrust the central bank, not the treasury, to create, quote, active money, end quote, through its fiscal, as opposed to its banking channel. So far, under the vague preconception of a continuing gold standard, quote, fiscal policy has been frequently thought to be the exclusive prerogative of the treasury, as monetary policy was of the central bank. Yet when the traditional bourgeois state expires, the two policies will have to be combined more explicitly under a welfare state. As usual, the whole text of this book has been very carefully and competently edited by my old friend, Professor John R. Bell. For John R. Bell's generous and highly prized help, I wish to express here my heartfelt thanks. Another friend of mine, Professor Richard Westra, was also kind enough to read part of the text of this book and offered some valuable comments and suggestions, of which I have been the grateful beneficiary. Thomas T. Sekine, Tokyo, Japan, December 2017. Acknowledgements. On behalf of our father and our family, we would like to thank his many colleagues providing us the support and guidance in publishing this final manuscript. We know Thomas Sekine would have liked to thank in particular Professor John R. Bell, Dr. Richard Westra, Dr. Makoto Ito, as well as Dr. Sumio Kamasaki and Dr. Hideo Okamoto, and the entire Suginami Kaizai Kenkyu Kai, which was always a source of inspiration and a place for spirited dialogue. Many thanks also to Professor Gavin Walker and Professor Ken Kawashima, as well as Brian Hioe, Hioe, and Ken Kubota, who were also part of the journey of this manuscript. Tokyo, October 2022, the Sekine family. I'm guessing Thomas Sekine is dead. Let's see. Is Thomas Sekine dead? Yes, he croaked. That's insensitive, but I love squeezing in the word croaked when I can. Real briefly, there's a page of praise for Marx Uno and the Critique of Economics. The first is from Makoto Ito, Professor Emeritus of the University of Tokyo and a member of the Japan Academy. This challenging book induces us to rethink how and why dominant neoclassical economics fails to present correct problems and solutions for really existing capitalism. It demonstrates how and why Kozo Uno, an original political economist, systematically restructured political economy with 3 levels of research: principles of political economy based on Marx's Capital, Stages theory of capitalist development, utilizing Lenin's book Imperialism, and concrete analyses of capitalism since the First World War. Sekine explains why the contemporary economy is mired in an era of ex-capitalist transition and offers policy recommendations for building really feasible socialism. Makoto Ito, Professor Emeritus. Sorry, I already said that. The next piece is from Richard Westra, author of Economics, Science, and Capitalism. Says, if the Nobel Prize in Economics was generally awarded for revolutionizing economic science, Thomas T. Sekine would have been one of its recipients. All right. I have to go. I'm going to finish reading this in another sitting. Table of Contents. Part 1, Introduction. Part 1, Chapter 1, Introduction, which I'll be reading, which is what I'm reading now, including all the stuff at the beginning. 2, Distinguishing Marxian economic theory from bourgeois political economy. 3, The scientificity of Marxian economic theory and the spuriousness of bourgeois natural science of society. 4, The necessity of levels of analysis in Marxian political economy. 5, Kozo Uno's elaboration of Marxism in the light of Marx and Hegel. Part 2. Chapter 6. Theorizing world economic change following the unraveling of the imperialist stage. 7. Bourgeois economics in the era of ex-capitalist transition. 8. Whither policy in the phase of capitalist disintegration. 9. Neoliberalism and the futility of monetarism. 10. Road to a new historical society. Part 1. Part 1 details the importance and the uniqueness of, quote, Uno Marxian economics, end quote, in both its theoretical and methodological foundation. It also emphasizes the fact that it is the only, quote, economics that can provide us with, quote, objective, end quote, knowledge of, quote, capitalism as a historical society, end quote, which neither mainstream bourgeois economics nor the conventional Marxist approach have ever done or can even hope to do. Chapter 1. Introduction. Says Précis box. I don't know how to say this. It might be Précis. It's P-R-E with an accent on top of it. CIS, Box 1. This chapter tracks how I originally came to economics, Marxism, and UNO, together with the circumstances in which I began studying Marxian economics under UNO's guidance in my undergraduate years and took a deep interest in it. I will then explain the reasons for my subsequently pursuing graduate training in mainstream bourgeois economics in the West. It foregrounds questions of my interest in Hegel's dialectic on the one hand and in the general equilibrium approach to economics in the Walrasian tradition on the other. Two things that do not at first sight seem to mix very well. Therefore, I will explain the way in which they are related to each other in my Unoist view of economics. I wish to state here that I could come to the present and hopefully more adequate understanding of Uno's teachings only very recently, quite a bit after my retirement from active service as an economics instructor. That's the end of the Pressy Box 1. (1A). Can you describe how you originally came to Marxism, when and how you were politicized, and finally why after 10 years of graduate training in mainstream, i.e., quote, bourgeois economics, you returned to Marxian economics, and specifically to its Unoist variation? Can you also tell us why, even though you greatly admire Marx, do you not wish to be called or identified as simply a, quote, Marxist? I entered Hitote Tsubashi University Social Science Division in 1953 in Japan, hoping vaguely to study in such areas as Western economic history, social and political thought, and the like. I was then not interested in economic theory in particular, but the intellectual climate that I encountered there was characterized by a sharp confrontation between, quote, bourgeois and, quote, Marxist economics, so much so that I had to decide first on which side I stood and declare it before being seriously heard by anyone. So I decided to begin by studying Marx's economics, towards which I felt a bit more congenial, mainly because I was not very confident in my mathematics, whereas I could by then more or less read in 3 European languages, including German. The choice was strictly personal and pragmatic. It was not at all political or ideological. Although I and my family generally sympathized with and supported left-wing politics then, I never took an activist stance. So when I began to study Marx, I was often called by my friends a, quote, salon Marxist, unquote. But I did not feel particularly annoyed, embarrassed, or offended by that reference. I rather felt that I deserved this epithet, which quite agreed with my middle-class background. In my third year in university, I got to know Kozo Uno, who lived from 1897 to 1977, who came to Hitote Tsubashi once a week to give a special lecture on Marx's economics. I was then deeply impressed by his approach, his scholarship, and especially his self-confident poise. That is what motivated me to pursue further studies in Marx's economics. But as I learned the subject in some depth, I felt that I also needed to be reasonably informed of, quote, bourgeois economics as well, which then appeared to me to be a credible rival discipline, even though that idea did not excite me all that much. When I was vacillating in that regard as a graduate student still at Hitote Tsubashi, I got a chance to study in Canada, so I went to McGill in 1958. From then on to my PhD in London, at the London School of Economics in 1966, I concentrated exclusively on so-called bourgeois economics. After obtaining my degree, I went to teach mainstream economics, mostly in micro theory and international trade, first at Simon Fraser and then at York University in Canada. I wrote papers on international monetary adjustment, inspired by Patinkin's, quote, real balance effect, unquote. But soon I became disenchanted with exercises along that line and decided to return to my original interest in Marx's economics under Uno's intellectual embrace. About that time, academic interest in Marx was beginning to revive in North America. I published a paper on Uno's approach in the Journal of Economic Literature in 1975, and a translation of his short 1965 edition of Principles of Political Economy into English in 1980. Thereafter, I concentrated on the formulation of Marx's economics along Unoist lines. At the same time, I established friendly contacts with many Japanese Unoists, but always at a courteous distance and often indirectly. I never worked closely with any one of them in particular. I rather preferred to operate as a lone wolf in Canada until 1994, and similarly even after returning to Japan in that year. They have their own ideas of Uno's work and I have mine. Obviously, our intellectual stances have remained quite apart. Perhaps the Japanese Unoists are more learned and faithful to the text of Uno's writing, whereas I feel much closer to his person and thought. Now, as to why I do not wish to be identified simply as a, quote, Marxist, is due to the fact that many, if not all, so-called Marxists do not seem to realize the importance of Marx primarily as an economist. They adore Marx for what he is not. Instead of for what he primarily is, or to put it otherwise, for what he is superficially made out to be, rather than what he really was. Marx is usually admired for having been a great socialist and a revolutionary. Volumes have been written and published on that side of Marx. But Marx can not be said to have been all that successful in providing consistently reliable guidelines for achieving real socialism. Indeed, Marx often inadvertently misled those who endeavored to follow him. For the latter often adopted misguided political practices that produced a number of monstrous and by now thoroughly discredited political experiments. That was, of course, not Marx's fault, for the blame must in all cases fall squarely on the shoulders of his superficial admirers, who are proud of calling themselves, quote, Marxists, with or without Marx's presumed approval. It is therefore important to understand what really makes this towering thinker and his work so unique and valuable to us. Contrary to the conventional idea, but echoing faithfully that of my mentor, Kozo Uno, I claim that it is because he was if not the foremost economist, in the sense that no serious history of economic thought or doctrine can ever be written without a very thorough reappraisal of Marx's economics, as it is encapsulated mainly in his immortal work, Das Kapital. What is truly, quote, revolutionary is Das Kapital, although most Marxists pay only lip service to it, without ever seriously understanding it or mastering its method and objectives. The claim may sound surprising to many, since the well-established conventional idea today, often shared even by Marxists themselves, is that the, quote, economics of Das Kapital has by now become completely obsolete or outdated, and that it only survives, if at all, as a, quote, museum piece, end quote. I am fully aware of and yet disapprove of that conventional view, which I believe is completely blind and false. I also argue that such an incorrect view has been carefully and deliberately nurtured and disseminated within and through the ideological superstructure of present-day society, with the aim of glorifying and eternalizing, quote, capitalism, as it conveniently, though quite incorrectly and superficially, although as it is conveniently, though quite incorrectly and superficially understood and made use of by adherents of this ideology, as the only rational economic base or mode of economic management or operation of any society. Many Marxists disagree with this view, yet they have failed because they never fathomed how to, quote, critique it, end quote, satisfactorily. The conventional view, furthermore, pretends that this vaguely, i.e. only loosely and conveniently defined idea of, quote, capitalism, or of, quote, the market-based economy, end quote, constitutes the ultimate stronghold of freedom and democracy in human society. Marxists know that this too is false, and do not hesitate to say so, yet they have so far failed to convincingly expose the fact that such a claim merely reflects the blind bourgeois liberal faith or ideology and does not stand on any solid or defensible ground of scientific knowledge. By the end of the present work in 2 parts, I will have shown how insufficient and inadequate the Marxists, not Marx's, critique of bourgeois economics and the knowledge of society built on it have so far proved to be. The reason for the shakiness of their opposition is due to the fact that Marxists, for the most part, simply do not know or even want to know what, quote, economics, end quote, is all about, or what sort of, quote, truth it proposes to prove. Either they have not seriously studied it, or in the process of studying bourgeois economics exclusively, they have been mesmerized into believing that Marx's economics can be largely reduced to such things as a mere, quote, linear production models, end quote, of some sort. So-called Sraffian and analytical Marxists are the most blatant outlandish examples of this pathetic error. In both cases, they have not criticized bourgeois economics in the same thoroughgoing manner as Marx himself, quote, critiqued, quote, the classical political economy of his time, but simply set up a Marxist ideology in opposition to the modernist bourgeois liberal ideology, before engaging in useless, quote, partisan brawls. But ideological battles are futile because the victory or defeat in such quarrels is decided only by faith and force at the level of religion and power politics, which appeals only to the, quote, warm heart, end quote, if at all, not by rigorous reasoning and reflection at the level of science and objective knowledge having to do with the, quote, cool head, end quote. What makes Marx's critique both remarkable and significant is that, contrary to the conventional idea, Marx did not wage mere ideological battles, but a scientific war in the domain of rigorous reflection and reasoning in economics. What makes Marx's critique both remarkable and significant is that, contrary to the conventional idea, Marx did not wage mere ideological battles, but a scientific war in the domain of rigorous reflection and reasoning in economics. This is what distinguishes Marx from the ilk of the utopian socialists. What he must do first of all is therefore to demonstrate, what we must do first of all is therefore to demonstrate that Marx's economics, unlike bourgeois economics, is not a one-sided and ideologically biased economics, but that it instead constitutes truly objective in the sense of ideology-free, i.e. trans and or super-ideological knowledge, if as yet in its incipient rather than in a fully worked-out form. Following Uno, I therefore wish to describe our approach to economics as, quote, Marxian, rather than simply, quote, Marxist, sharply distinguishing between these two qualifiers. New section 1b. You seem to believe that, quote, Marxian economics, end quote, is defensible as scientific or objective knowledge, whereas, quote, bourgeois economics is not, since the latter amounts only to a religion. Is that not the opposite of what is generally believed and accepted? How did you arrive at your own outlandish belief? Yes, it so happens that my own view of economics developed under Uno's influence is almost the exact opposite of the one that is widely and conventionally held. And that is why I wish to explain what I wish to explain in the following pages. The prevailing opinion today is that Marx's economics is now completely obsolete or outdated, and retains no more than an archaeological value. This view now seems to be more or less universally shared, given that it has been carefully nurtured and spread by the prestigious academic institutions in many Western democracies. But that only has to do with how things look or are made out to look, rather than with how and what they really are. One of the reasons why appearance overshadows reality in this instance is that ideologically motivated Marxists have so far failed to fundamentally criticize or critique bourgeois economics. Ideologically motivated Marxists have so far failed to fundamentally criticize or critique bourgeois economics. By shrinking from that vital task, they have also, in consequence, eschewed from systematically reviewing and reformulating Marx's economics in the fully up-to-date and defensible language of the profession. For no one can criticize bourgeois economics from the outside without being oneself versed in its particular paradigm. I did not know how economics is taught and studied in many other countries, but at the time I went to university in Japan, the study of economics was rather sharply divided into Marxist and bourgeois modernist versions, so that those who were trained by Marxist professors were usually not adequately trained in bourgeois economics and vice versa. When I went to Canada as a graduate student, I was bitterly made aware of that cold fact for the first time. Whatever I had known of bourgeois economics by then was no more than a shallow, dilettantist knowledge of it from the outside at most, and did not qualify as part of professional knowledge. I therefore had to be completely retrained in bourgeois economics before I began my career as an academic economist in the West. It was only some years thereafter that I returned to Uno's earlier teaching in Marxian economics and came to fully recognize its unparalleled value. I thus engaged myself in reformulating his thought in a way that even bourgeois economists, so far unfamiliar with and untrained in Marx's writings, could, if willing, readily understand and appreciate what is so fundamentally different and valuable in them. In other words, I tried to restate them systematically in the up-to-date language of economic analysis, rather than insisting on its original 19th century language and or merely regurgitating it with a modern flavor. Specifically, I tried as far as possible to formulate Marxian economic theories in rigorous mathematical terms, where appropriate, rather than being content with merely, quote, illustrating them with apparently suitable numerical examples. With merely, quote, illustrating them with apparently suitable numerical examples, end quote. This is something that no Japanese Unoist has done to any satisfactory extent. It is for this reason that I preferred to separate as a lone wolf in my own enterprise rather than working closely with any one of the Japanese Unoists, as I have stated above. Of course, it would have been much easier and nicer if I could have worked together with, quote, kindred spirits. Yet there were also advantages in avoiding, quote, party talks, when solitary meditation is more effective and indeed indispensable. Uno himself would not have achieved what he did had he worked with a group of vociferous, if friendly Marxists, mostly convinced activists who could have been as cheerful as diversionary. As I will discuss in greater detail below, the, quote, Ricardian school of classical economics disintegrated as a consequence of its being unable to solve satisfactorily the so-called transformation problem, i.e. the problem of explaining the compatibility of the labor theory of value with the so-called law of average profit, though they are actually the same thing, looked at from different angles. It then became divided, according to Wicksell, into two camps, the Ricardian socialist and the Smithian harmonist, with the latter group eventually merging into the neoclassical school. In retrospect, this latter school both enriched and impoverished economics simultaneously. The neoclassical school both enriched and impoverished economics simultaneously, as I will elaborate further below, with its faith in the virtue of the competitive market to buy itself, achieve what looks like the, quote, pre-established harmony, end quote, of initially conflicting, quote, monadological, end quote, i.e. individual interests. It confirmed economics as a religious dogma whereby to glorify the, quote, ought of capitalism, while it also applied systematically rigorous mathematical tools to demonstrate the capacity of that same mechanism. If it impoverished economics in the first aspect, it greatly enriched it in the second. Indeed, if the mathematical tools of economic analysis explored later by the neoclassical school had been available earlier to the Ricardian school of classical political economy, perhaps there would not have been any need for the latter to break up at all, nor for the labor theory of value to be abandoned, giving way to the shallow utility theory. For with relatively simple mathematics, the so-called transformation problem would have been fairly easily solved, and Marx's numerical illustration of it in the third volume of Capital would not have been exposed to as much hostile animadversion. Needless to say, mathematics must not be applied blindly and haphazardly to Marxian economic theory without giving due regard to its dialectical structure. which will be explained below. For example, Marx talks of the transformation of values into prices primarily in the, quote, dialectical sense, end quote. Whereas after von Bortkiewicz, the same word, Verwandlung, has been interpreted only in its mathematical sense of, quote, mapping one point in the, quote, value space, end quote, to another in the, quote, price space, end quote, and vice versa. I have elsewhere elaborated on these two meanings of the word, quote, transformation. In any case, in order to benefit from the cross-fertilization of the two great paradigms in economics, Marxian and bourgeois, one has to study both of them with sufficient depth. In this regard, I not only had the great fortune of meeting a great Marxian economist of Uno's caliber and stature, while still being an undergraduate, but I also had the special privilege later of coming across many competent and superb teachers, colleagues, and students in, quote, bourgeois economics, end quote, who taught me the essential tools of that paradigm, which single-handedly I would not have been able to appropriate easily myself. I remain forever grateful to them all. Furthermore, economics, in a sense, is, quote, bourgeois by economics' very nature, inasmuch as economics was born with the coming of, quote, modern society, the economic substructure of which was to be, quote, capitalism, using this term in the sense of Marx's, quote, capitalist mode of production, end quote. From the beginning, classical political economy, wherefrom Marx too learned his economics, was charged with the special mission of broadcasting far and wide that capitalism was not only superior to any preceding system of society's economic management, but also attained the pinnacle of human achievements in the economic realm. The advent of capitalism, however, meant that the most prevalent and key issues that the real economic life of society then needed and wanted could be more readily produced as commodities than otherwise, and that this fact entailed the predominance of the mercantile principle of capital, in the operation of the whole economy. When this trend became increasingly more evident, bourgeois political economy discovered, quote, economic theory, end quote, at its core, for the latter is essentially the software or inner program which motivates capital, or which it employs, in organizing the real economic life of society by means of its own principles. Surely such a program will become more valid and effective the more the use values that society requires and demands become themselves more easily adapted to the commodity form. The more the use values that society requires and demands become themselves more easily adapted to the commodity form, and so also to capital's, quote, mercantile, end quote, principle. That is to say, they tend to become increasingly more, quote, neutral, devoid of substance, end quote, or, quote, nominal, in the sense that they are distinguishable one from another only by their names. As they tend to become increasingly more, quote, neutral, devoid of substance, end quote, or, quote, nominal, in the sense that they are distinguishable one from another only by their names. In other words, if A and B are no more than just different names given to the use value of any two commodities, it implies that they should be produced and or made available for trading under similar technological and market conditions. It should be presupposed that A and B are similar or closely comparable use values, products, technologically as well as in terms of market efficiency or disposability. We say that the use values of A and B are only, quote, nominally, end quote, different, when we imply that they are similarly producible technically and similarly circulatable, end quote, in the market from the point of view of their supplier. Even though that may not be so relevant from the point of view of their demander. Thus, commodities must be like children of the same class and the same grade, where prodigies and slow learners are rare, so that the teacher can deal with his/her pupils quite alike. That is, he can teach them the same lesson and expect from them similar, if not the same, performance. The use values of A and B must be more or less easily made commodifiable. And once commodified, they will behave quite alike in the market. For capitalism is essentially the software or inner program that capital employs in order to organize the real economic life of society by means of its own principles. Surely, such a program will become the more effective and valid, the more the use values that society requires and demands in large quantities become themselves more easily, quote, commodifiable, end quote, adapted to the commodity form, and hence adapted to capital's, quote, mercantile principles, end quote. That is to say, as the use values tend to become increasingly more neutral, devoid of substance with sensuous connotations and associations, or, quote, nominal, in the sense that they are distinguishable, one from another, only by their names, and not for any of their other substantive qualities that might sensuously appeal to this consumer, but not to that consumer, the more likely will capitalism secure this solid ground upon which it may nurture itself. Thus, it makes sense that the golden age of classical political economy coincided with the evolution of capitalism from its infancy to adulthood, from the mercantilist to the liberal stage of development. For, quote, economic theory always presupposes that all use values are more easily commodifiable than they would be in any actual situation. For, quote, economic theory always presupposes that all use values are more easily commodifiable than they would be in any actual situation. This indeed is a tacit presupposition in all economic theories, whether bourgeois, liberal, conventionally Marxist, or Uno-Marxian. The difference is that the first two ideological schools of economics accept this presupposition as a matter of course without any serious reflection, while the last school alone founds itself explicitly upon the material tendency for world capitalism to reach the zenith of its historical process of self-purification in mid-19th century Great Britain. New section. 1C. What in your view constitutes the most fundamental difference between the classical and Marxian approach to economic theory? That difference follows from the methodologically distinct manner in which the abstraction of, quote, nominalized use values, end quote, is accepted. That difference follows from the methodologically distinct manner in which the abstraction of, quote, nominal use values, end quote, is accepted. The classical approach accepts in its theory the nominalization of use values simply because it is, quote, divine, or beyond human experience, such that any deviation from the norm is due to human aberrations. The Marxian approach, in contrast, claims that capitalism itself, at one point in its historical evolution, displayed the real tendency towards self-purification or self-idealization, the mental extrapolation of which justifies the nominalization of use values. The Marxian approach, in contrast, claims that capitalism itself, at one point in capitalism's historical evolution, displayed the real tendency towards self-purification or self-idealization, the mental extrapolation of which justifies the nominalization of use values. Whereas the former approach wants to neutralize or nominalize the use values subjectively on the ground of faith in the perfectibility of capitalism. The latter approach seeks to ground the same abstraction, quote, materialistically or objectively, end quote, as tending to evolve most successfully at one particular spatio-temporal point in the actual history of capitalist development itself, specifically in mid-19th century Britain. I will return to this contrast a number of times below in different contexts, but it is important to understand even at this point that the, quote, classical procedure drops all the historical dimensions from capitalism. Instead of understanding capitalism as a, quote, historical society, end quote, that is to say at once as one that is historically transient, so that it comes into being at one point in human history and passes away at another, the classical approach lays down capitalism basically as God's design, something that is permanent so that it has always existed and will always exist, even though humans, because of their limited finite intelligence, did not realize it at first and took a long time before this gradually dawned on them, in much the same way as they routinely discover new wonders of nature. This is in tune with the bourgeois tendency to reduce the knowledge of society to the same plane as that of nature, a fundamental misapprehension which, as I will elaborate on later, will only serve the hierarchy and investment interests, i.e. power structure, of the existing society by making it irrevocably adore and idolize, quote, capitalism. Indeed, if the social order were as immutable as the natural order, any attempt at modifying or, quote, redesigning, end quote, society would amount to a sacrilege in defiance of God's design, something that we should never even dare to think about. I do not know to what extent Adam Smith was influenced by such things as, quote, monads, and the, quote, pre-established harmony, end quote, among them, the philosophical or semi-theological ideas which had been conceived and expounded by Gottfried Leibniz about a century before Smith. But a great scholar of Smith's caliber and a close friend of David Hume could not have been wholly unaware of Leibniz's imposing doctrine. Thus Smith's reference to the invisible hand suggests Smith's intent to vindicate the virtue of the capitalist market in the light of divine wisdom. Thus Smith's reference to the invisible hand suggests his intent to vindicate the virtue of the capitalist market in the light of divine the virtue of the capitalist market in the light of divine wisdom. But today, as the authority of theology and metaphysics has waned in the shadow of the more glittering advances in the natural sciences and technology, economics tends to lean more on its affinity or similitude with them in order to claim its, quote, scientific authenticity. But precisely there lies a fatal trap. For, by adorning its basically ideological or religious conclusions with an appearance that is, quote, natural scientific, end quote, it merely serves the interest of the existing society's establishment or power structure, rather than enlightening the society's population with regard to its impending historical trend. An economics that is not firmly grounded on the history of capitalism, but only on its myth, is a religion that can easily be made use of by the powers that be, as I will illustrate below. I must emphasize this point, even though I keenly recognize the fact that, while Marxists in their turn are also busy themselves with their own ideological battles, in many futile exercises, ignoring Marx's truly scientific achievement in economics, its bourgeois version had far outpaced its Marxist counterpart in the mathematical reformulation of economic theory, going well beyond the 19th century or earlier practice of merely illustrating it with some convenient numerical examples. Going well beyond the 19th century or earlier practice of merely illustrating it with some convenient numerical examples. Of course, the use of mathematics in Marxian economics must be undertaken with discretion in the light of its dialectical context, and not haphazardly in blind imitation of the practice in bourgeois economics, as I mentioned earlier. At this point, I would limit myself to pointing out the perfect compatibility between mathematics, a representative case of analytic or formal logic, and the dialectical, synthetic logic best adapted for the formulation of economic theory as the internal logic of capitalism. To do so, however, I need to share with you an elementary or preliminary idea of the, quote, dialectic of capital, unquote, the purpose of which is to, quote, logically synthesize the complex concept of capitalism, unquote. This cannot be done as simply as in Euclidean geometry by first laying down several defining sentences and plausible axioms or postulates, wherefrom to derive a set of tautologically equivalent statements as, quote, theorems, based on those plausible axioms or postulates. That is the method of constructing a parallel, quote, model in simulation of a natural phenomenon, used extensively by natural scientists. When the object of study is historical and more complex, however, as in the case of capitalism, in the sense of Marx's, quote, capitalist mode of production, quote, we must adopt the method of logically, i.e. dialectically synthesizing its pure concept. Quote, pure, meaning, quote, devoid of all sensuous connotations or suggestions, unquote. This method is best illustrated. Excuse me, one second. There's a footnote here. End note. Marx himself did not use the term, quote, capitalism, since apparently such a word did not exist at Marx's time. Marx instead talked about the, quote, capitalist mode of production, quote. But since this expression is rather long and cumbersome, it has become customary for many authors, including Uno, to use the word, quote, capitalism for short in the sense of Marx's, quote, capitalist mode of production, quote. Thus, when Uno spoke of, quote, capitalism, he always meant it in the strict sense of Marx's, quote, capitalist mode of production. This is quite natural, since by Uno's time many economists of the late historical school, such as Werner Sombart and Max Weber, liberally talked of, quote, capitalism in the broad sense. Moreover, the word, quote, capitalism has by now gained much broader popularity in the press and in daily conversations, often with uncertain implications. My claim here is that the real concept of the term, quote, capitalism equals the capitalist mode of production, quote, can be logically defined or synthesized only as the, quote, dialectic of capital, unquote, inherent in Marx's book, Capital, and in Uno's Genviron, the pure theory of capitalism. End footnote. This method is best illustrated by Hegel's, quote, logic that coincides, content-wise, with metaphysics, end quote, to the structure of which the, quote, dialectic of capital, end quote, must be iso or homomorphic. Just as the former is divided into the three main doctrines of being, essence, and the notion, the dialectic of capital is divided into three doctrines of circulation, forms, production and distribution of surplus value. In the first doctrine, the dialectic of transition, or of, quote, passing over from one form to another, end quote, is at work, while the dialectic of reflection or grounding, and that of unfolding or development, are at work in the second and the third doctrines, respectively. It is important to distinguish between these three distinct types of the dialectic, although at the popular level only the first type is usually presented with Hegel's famous triad of Sein, Nix, Werden, being nothing, becoming. For general illustration of the method of the dialectic, with haphazard and perfunctory explications of the dialectical method, which will permanently bewilder and stupefy the public, never again to recover its own sound sense of judgment thereafter. In the dialectic of capital, the first doctrine of circulation deals only with the three basic, sometimes called simple, forms of circulation, which are the commodity, money, and capital. The agent of the dialectic here is, quote, value, the mercantile quality immanent in the commodity. The agent of the dialectic here is value, the mercantile quality immanent in the commodity. When it liberates itself from its counterpart, the use value of the same commodity, it becomes money, the means of purchase. But when money is used not just to buy commodities for individual consumption or production, but for a gainful resale, so as to earn a surplus value as profit, that money becomes capital, such that the concept of capital as value in self-augmenting motion is already inherent in money. In this way, the dialectic, or, quote, transition or becoming, end quote, enables us to pass entirely from the form of the commodity to that of money, and then further on from the form of money to that of capital. Capital here is simply the, quote, form that is ready to pursue, quote, surplus value, end quote, as profit. Yet unless surplus value is produced, rather than merely dispossessed from others, profit remains, quote, relative, in the sense that one's gain is another's loss. Therefore, of all the forms of capital, quote, industrial capital, end quote, figures naturally as the ultimate, quote, form that will constitute the outer skin, or, quote, integument, end quote, visible only from the outside of the capitalist mode of production. In the doctrine of production, however, the dialectic can no longer, quote, pass so easily from, quote, one form to another, end quote, as in the doctrine of simple circulation. It must instead explain all the ways in which industrial capital, quote, subsumes and reflects, end quote, the productive base of society, so as to render its, quote, production of surplus value, end quote, both systematic and most efficient. This is the dialectic of, quote, reflection or of grounding, end quote, specific to the doctrine of production, in which the relation between capital and labor that lies hidden underneath the circulatory integument, quote, integument of capitalism, is highlighted as the main theme, so that, whether as the representative individual capital microeconomically, or as the aggregate social capital macroeconomically, industrial capital, is not yet differentiated into different branches of use value production, nor even into loan capital and commercial capital, so as to be able to assist industrial capital proper in its surplus value production in indirect and specialized ways. To assist industrial capital proper in surplus value production in indirect and specialized ways. That will occur only in the last doctrine of distribution, in which the dialectic of, quote, unfolding, Entfaltung, end quote, dictates the way in which the already produced surplus value as industrial profit may be suitably divided and distributed to those that operate in different branches of industry, and may also be shared not only by landed property, but also by the specialized and derivative forms of capital, such as loan capital and commercial capital, into which industrial capital will be differentiated. These have all contributed indirectly, if not directly, to the production of maximal surplus value. In all these facets, the dialectic always proceeds from, quote, abstract, a concept that is not yet fully specified, to, quote, concrete, a concept that is more adequately specified than before, until ultimately the concept of capitalism is fully specified in logical terms. It turns out that economic theory as a logical synthesis of capitalism cannot be adequately stated except in this dialectical form, which I therefore call the dialectic of capital. New section. When and how did you manage to arrive at that idiosyncratic conclusion of yours in your career in economics? The economics curriculum in universities encompasses a wide range of applied and specialized fields, with the consequence that most teachers are familiar with only a few of them, depending on their aptitude and/or predilection. But the novice has to experiment in some or other of these many fields for various contingent reasons. I wanted to develop a monetary theory of international adjustment by adapting Patinkin's, quote, real balance effect, end quote, in which my thesis work had led me. I was interested in relating it with the older theory of, quote, purchasing power shift, or Kaufkraftverschiebung, end quote, an international transfer theory, much talked about after World War I in connection with the German reparation problem. But before I could reach any definitive conclusion in regard to this matter, I found that the academic profession was no longer interested in macroeconomics in that style. In retrospect, this was about the time when the Chicago School was beginning to regain the influence that it had once lost to Keynes. I was disenchanted with the fickleness of bourgeois economics and decided to return to the more solid foundation of Marxian economics that I had learned from Una earlier. By this time, however, I was sufficiently familiar with the paradigm of bourgeois economics and its language. At around the same time, I also became interested in debates in the field of the, quote, scientific method, or, quote, philosophy of science, and concluded that I could best explain the nature of Uno's approach in the light of Hegel's dialectic, as it was combined with Walras' general equilibrium theory. Although Uno's rather abstruse writing style in Japanese is often thought to be, quote, untranslatable, end quote, into English, I found encouragement in the fact that, equally difficult as it may have been, both Hegel and Walras had already been so admirably translated into English by such great masters, e.g. as W. Wallace and W. Jaffa, or Jaff? Not sure. As I began to think about introducing, translating, and elaborating on Uno's teachings for an English-speaking audience, I was inspired by their example and virtuosity. While being thus engaged in the work of reformulating the Uno-style approach of Marx's economics, I was also deeply influenced by Karl Polanyi's works and those of his Japanese admirer, Yoshiro Tomonoi, who lived from 1918 to 1985, from whom I had much to learn. Under the latter's guidance, I was made aware of the importance of entropy theory and ecology. Entropy theory and ecology, the concepts that economics, in both the bourgeois and Marxist traditions, had systematically neglected long since, even though they have crucial bearings on today's real economy. By that time, my research areas diverged widely from the subjects of my university teaching and even from bourgeois economics in general. But I was fortunate enough to have a tolerant, friendly, and understanding academic environment around me. I was never under pressure to publish in the neoclassical field alone. After returning to Japan in 1994, I spent the last 10 years of my active teaching at Aichi Gakuen University in Nagoya as a professor of international trade in its School of Commerce. There I quickly found that, quote, the pure theory of international trade, and, quote, in economics with which I was, to some extent, familiar, was not what a school of commerce or business wanted to learn, even to hear about. So I had to prepare myself to teach the more practical side of international trade, such as the GATT treaties for freer trade and the multilateral, quote, rounds of negotiations leading up to the WTO, and the significance of such bilateral trade negotiations as the ones between Japan and the United States in particular. This, however, gave me a completely new outlook on the nature of U.S. trade policy and its international strategy in the post-World War II era. Thus, my career as an economics teacher kept me quite busy, and it also required that I familiarize myself with a wide range of applied fields, each of which in turn spread out further into various subfields. Meanwhile, I was also reading in history, philosophy, the scientific method, and Marxism, but not always as thoroughly as I deemed was ideally required. Some I studied in relative depth, while others I learned more casually and superficially. The sum total of all these things that I had managed to learn, by the time I retired from my active teaching, amounted to a rather amorphous jumble of many disparate bits and pieces. I was more or less confident of the pure theory part of my reformulation in regard to Uno's approach to Marx's economics, which he called Genreron, the pure theory of capitalism, and which I renamed as the dialectic of capital. But, so far as the relative status within his overall system of his Dankairon, or the stages theory of capitalist development, and his Katokairon, or the theory of the transition away from capitalism to a new historical society beyond it after World War I, which Uno himself hardly elaborated, were concerned, I was never quite sure of and often remained largely in the dark. I formulated my own idea of the quote, ex-capitalist transition and quote, quite early in my career in 1974, to be precise, in an essay published in Japanese. But after several attempts at arguing it more convincingly, I was far from satisfied with my own manner of explication. I thus thought that I would probably end my career as an academic economist in quite an open-ended fashion, that is with many gaps and unsettled problems, since that seemed to me to be how most colleagues of mine ended their career in our profession. I was therefore determined to spend the rest of my life doing things other than economics, so much so that I even donated nearly half my library in my university office to junior colleagues of mine instead of carrying it home, where space to pile up books was limited. Yet there was one unfinished project which had been interrupted for many years and which demanded completion, since before the interruption I had troubled many persons for their well-meaning and selfless cooperation. That was a translation into English of Uno's Kaizai Saizakuron, the types of economic policies under capitalism, which has recently, in 2016, been published by Brill of Leiden. My work on that project had been almost as soon as my translation of his 1965 Kazai Genron, The Principles of Political Economy, was published in 1980 by the now defunct Harvester Press. The first section, on mercantilism, was compiled in short order, but the remaining two sections on liberalism and imperialism had not even been begun. When I was swamped with other more pressing duties, I thus thought I would finish this possibly final project after my retirement. As I progressed in the translation of that book, however, the significance of the stages theory as mediating between the pure theory and the empirical history of capitalism became increasingly clearer to me. I had long been aware that Marxists often casually talked of a, quote, dialectical union of theory and history, end quote, but that kind of empty slogan never convinced or impressed either Uno or myself. I had also known a few works by Japanese Unoists supposedly focused on stages theory, yet these hardly related the episodes of their study in capitalist history with the pure theory of capitalism in any convincing or significant manner. Uno's book must surely have intended something quite different from what is made apparent in these efforts. What it rather shows is how each of the, quote, 3 stages of capitalist development, preparatory, autonomous, and declining, correspond with the production of a very specific type of use value, such as wool, cotton, and steel products, respectively, which in each case also involved a different type of industrial technology and organization specific to the particular stage. The latter determine the dominant or representative form of capital, merchant, industrial, and finance capital, the mode of accumulation, which is in turn assisted by the types of economic policies specific to a particular stage, mercantilist, liberal, and imperialist of the bourgeois state. The latter determine the dominant or representative form of capital, merchant, industrial, and finance capital, the mode of accumulation of which is in turn assisted by the types of economic policies specific to a particular stage, mercantilist, liberal, and imperialist of the bourgeois state. These are the types of economic policies that the bourgeois nation state must undertake in order to render the accumulation of the dominant or representative form of capital most efficient. Thus, even though a purely capitalist society does not exist in physical reality, but only in our minds, as the limiting point to which historical capitalism at one point in time actually did tend to approach. But only in our minds, as the limiting point to which historical capitalism at one point in time actually did tend to approach. The latter, capitalism in history, always appears within the framework or carapace of the modern bourgeois nation state. The modern bourgeois nation state, where law, politics, and economics meet in the attempt to develop an integrated theory of the state. The theory of the bourgeois state. The theory of the bourgeois state must therefore come in three types. The mercantilist state, based on the absolute monarchy, or in more recent jargon, a quote, developmental dictatorship, end quote, represents the incipient or preparatory stage of capitalist development. The liberal state based on, quote, civil society, or, quote, parliamentary democracy, end quote, represents the autonomous stage of capitalist development. And the imperialist state, based on military confrontation between competing groups of nations, composed of the heavily armed leading powers, and so prone to tariff wars and colonial expansion, represents the declining stage of capitalist development. In this way, the history of capitalism is divided into three world historic developmental stages. After World War I, capitalism leaves the, quote, process of its development, end quote, through these stages and enters the, quote, process of capitalism's disintegration, end quote, where the latter is also the process of the disintegration of the bourgeois capitalist state. It is in this way that, in Unna's approach to the stages theory, mediates between the purely logical theory of capitalism, the dialectic of capital, and the empirical history of capitalisms. That we as humans have experienced collectively as our own histoire vécu. I don't know. I believe that I finally discerned, rather late in my life, the full import and implications of Unna's method of Marxian economics. And that's the end of the chapter, and everything at the beginning, of Marx, Unna, and the Critique of Economics by Thomas T. Sekine. I don't know how much of this book I'm going to read, especially in any reasonable time frame, but I just wanted to check out the introduction and the opening parts. Thank you so much for listening.